Let's talk about the Ministry of Truth, Joe Biden, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., and his Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board. So this has been one of the big topics in the news now for quite a while. And for those people that don't know, I think we should give a very basic overview, but the Department of Homeland Security created a new little disinformation governance board. The mission of that board was a little bit foggy and unclear, to which they agreed and admitted to. But the idea was to eliminate propaganda that as they saw. So Nick, why don't you give your
I think the original stated goal was to combat disinformation around some specific topics. They mentioned like immigration, around elections and whatnot. And I think COVID-19. And it was a disastrous rollout. I mean, they got this Orwellian name, utter lack of detail. And the timing was could not have been worse. So they roll out this disinformation governance board at the same time Elon's talking about free speech and about to go on his rating of Twitter. And so with that backdrop, they unleash this government oriented and organized way of telling what's true and what's not. And then on top of that, they add a disinformation czar that had made public partisan statements prior to her being appointed. And so all that wrapped up, I mean, the quick, references to George Orwell's 1984 just came out. The Ministry of Truth is actually in the book 1984. And it was this group that determined what was true and what was false, and often rewrite history to whatever the narrative of the day was. So yeah, that was what happened. That was its stated goal without the detail, and just terrible rollout. And yeah, there's plenty to go on
Nick,
from here. But it's
what was the actual name of this thing, by the way?
Disinformation. That's what it is. Disinformation Governance Board.
Right.
So Nick, do you think
only
that
slightly S Orwellian than the real name?
Yeah, exactly. Do you think, Nick, that something like this was needed and could be necessary and or effective? Do you see a world at all where something like this is necessary? Say it was rolled out properly, say the manifesto was more clear, say the timing was better. Is there a role that the Department of Homeland Security or the government should be playing with this in any world that you imagine?
Let's state the obvious that they're classifying this era as the era of misinformation, but that has always been true. And it's because there's new communication technologies, Twitter, social media, faster pace of communication, and so there's new ways of information to be spread, and that has always existed. I think when they were going to create the cross-Atlantic, telegraph, they were worried that information was going to flow too fast, and people often, resort to the censor button really quickly when there's these new technologies and new ways of communicating, and misinformation has always existed in multiple areas of communication, because that's kind of inherent to, I think, the human species. So I think that's one. And I just kind of get confused on how a lot of the default is for people to give the power or the decision-making power more to government, give them more budget and have them solve the problem. When, in America, people should have the ability to decide what they think is right. They should have the freedom to be wrong. They should have a freedom to be an asshole and not face any kind of retribution specifically from any kind of government entity. I looked up a stat that I thought was pretty interesting. And I was like, okay, this is an instance of, the government trying to decide what is right and what is wrong. And so I actually looked up false positives on death penalty, because that is the most important crucial decision a government, organization can make, and particularly like, judges in the legal system. And it turns out that for every 8.3 people that have been put to death in the US since executions resumed in the 1970s, there's been one person who's been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death.
That's so fucked
okay.
up.
So we're talking about freedom of speech and just what people's thoughts are on COVID and immigration and whatnot. But when you really hone in on something so critical as to like, do we put this person to death or not?
Playing God.
Government organizations are not able to be fully accurate. There's over a 10% defect rate. And so when you compare that, I don't know if a government organization is the right way to kind of weight that decision-making power inside of.
By the way, that's after
interesting.
going through our entire judicial process, which is very intense. There are checks and balances on it that would never exist with a Ministry of Truth, Disinformation Governance Board. They would just say what they say. And the funniest thing,
still can't get it right.
Yeah, you still can't get it right.
And my kind of last point on this is like, when you give government power, let's say they are trying to be objective, they have true intentions, but government organizations, they have multiple administration turnovers. They have expanding budgets, they have decreasing budgets, they have scope creep, they have different priorities of the time. And that power could easily morph and be justified to do something far from its original intention. And so that's where I get always suspicious of like, is the answer to give more power to government rather than, let people decide and assume that, the population is not as stupid as it seems.
Okay, so that's good, because I think like where I'm at is I don't want to focus so much on the government initiative on it. It's like, I want to ask you guys, and maybe you don't need to answer right now, but think about it. Like, how do you even filter for truth as a human being, right? And I imagine that you all consider yourselves like above median in terms of ability to do this as a human being. But like, how do you filter? And then, thinking about the future or even the now, it's like, it's becoming like an imperative skill to be able to identify, like parse out truth from bullshit, right? Because bullshit's everywhere. How do you do it yourself? And then like understanding that it is a fucking tough task. Maybe the government isn't the answer, like having some government solution, but like there needs to be a solution, like for a person to be able to like determine what's real and what's not. And it's hard, and it's going to get harder and harder because like pretty soon we're going to be able to deep fake everything. We're going to be able to like visually fake anything that we want to. So you can't trust your eyes anymore. What are you going to fucking trust? It's actually a hard question.
It is. I like Vitalik's perspective on this. I sent you guys his tweet thread. I'm sure you guys have seen it, but one of the points that he made was that he basically had this tweet thread of contradictions in his life, right? And one of the contradictions was my contradiction between my love for things like decentralization and democracy, and my realization that in practice, I agree with intellectual elites more than, quote, the people on many, though definitely far from all, specific policy issues. What a fascinating thing. I think my filter oftentimes is also the intellectual elite. We talked about this. Nick mentioned this, that his filter for information and news, right, specifically is us, each other, the people that he trusts to disseminate and provide that and filter that information to him. Give people access to the information. Let them decide for themselves what truth is at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, after that, yes, the mob and the people are going to have the power to determine and create the change that they need to make. But in the type of democracy that we live in, at the end of the day, we're putting people in charge to make good decisions for us. And we have to make sure our voices are heard. But that doesn't mean that they should take away our right to determine what is what in the first place. So this whole concept of like, I am here, big brother, the government, to do the hard work for you of determining what is true. from the moment it starts, it's going to fail. I think there's a lot to discuss within this, and I'm sure Stephen, there's so many things within even the article we were reading earlier today that stood out to you. The Washington Post put out this I mean, I never read like these types of like media outlet articles, but it was absolutely terrible and full of contradictions. But like one of the things that was in there was just this idea that I thought was partly true that I just want to address, that when this Disinformation Governance Board was announced, the journalist argued that that the right took this idea and ran with it, and that they have a playbook, and that their playbook is to dramatize and to pick out and parse out things and exaggerate them and distract and turn things into a mockery and turn things into memes. And that's actually pretty true. like yes, like that's true. That is like the playbook in so many ways. And yes, the right does like exaggerate things and go to the most extreme version of what they might look like. And we can dig into that. But for me, this actually was like, in so many ways, a victory for democracy. Maybe that is a strong statement, but I think that if the people were able to provide enough of a response that made a government organization realize that they don't want to admit it, but maybe this was a mistake in the first place, and they paused. And now, as of today, as the time we're recording this on May 18th, they literally did pause and fully, I think, Nick, you said they fully they're
going to go into review from two former DHS officials from both parties and review it, but you can call it done for.
Call it done. The fact that happened in response to social media, the people, and by the way, they call it that the far right is doing this. It's obviously not true. We joke about this. If you ain't left, you're far right. I think it's kind of like a victory. I like it. I think it's cool.
This is going to be like a Kobe Shaq alley-oop from Armand to Steven. I want to see. I want to see what happens next.
Bring it, Shaq.
Dunk it home, Shaq.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like,
let it rip.
I never took.
Let it rip, Lord.
I never took this thing that seriously. It was almost just like so fucking stupid from the get-go that you just knew it was going to collapse into just this flaming pile of wreckage. And this girl was like literally on TikTok singing like Mary Poppins songs about disinformation, and meanwhile all her tweets are still up about like the Hunter Biden laptop being like Russian propaganda. It's just like, it's almost like you can't even script this stuff. It's so stupid.